Let's wind the clock back to a time when 16 Candles felt like the perfect teenage dream. The film still lives in memory as something bright, funny, and full of the kind of youthful romance that never really fades. But behind those familiar faces, time ended up telling a much harsher story. Some of these stars held on to fame. Others slipped into silence, scandal, heartbreak, or lives so different from what fans once imagined. And the deeper you look, the more this cast begins to feel less like a nostalgic movie memory and more like a hidden record of what Hollywood leaves behind. So let us go back and see what really happened after the candles burned out. Let's start with the face most people remember first. In 16 Candles, Molly Ringwald was not just playing Samantha Baker. She became the emotional center of an entire generation's idea of teenage longing. With her quiet sadness, awkward charm, and unmistakable screen presence, she looked like the kind of star who had everything waiting for her. To millions of fans, she was the girl at the center of the story, the one Hollywood seemed ready to protect forever. But fame has a way of preserving an image while wearing down the person inside it. As the years passed, Ringwald's life moved far beyond the red-haired icon audiences thought they knew. In 1999, she married French writer Valérie Lamonnière and moved to France, a decision that seemed almost romantic from the outside. It looked like an escape from Hollywood pressure, a chance to build something quieter and more meaningful. Instead, that chapter reportedly became one of emotional distance and deep personal isolation. Living abroad pulled her away not only from the industry that made her famous, but also from the version of herself people had spent years celebrating. When the marriage collapsed in 2002, it left behind more than heartbreak. It marked the end of a dream that had promised reinvention and delivered exhaustion instead. What made Molly's story even more complicated was that time did not simply change her life. It changed her relationship with her own legacy. For years, whispers followed her about rivalries, ego, and the power she may have held during her rise in the Brat Pack era. Then, much later, she shocked many longtime fans by openly criticizing parts of the very films that turned her into a symbol, including 16 Candles. To some, it felt like betrayal. To others, it felt like honesty finally catching up with nostalgia. As of 2026, Molly Ringwald is 58 years old, married to writer Panio Giannopoulos, and raising a family while continuing to write and act selectively. Her estimated net worth is about $12 million. But what makes her story linger is not the money or even the fame. It is the uneasy truth that sometimes the person who defined an era no longer sees that era the way the world does. For a lot of viewers, Michael Schoeffling was not just another cast member in 16 Candles. He was the fantasy. As Jake Ryan, he carried the kind of effortless charm that made the character feel larger than the movie itself. Calm, handsome, almost unreal, he became the face of the perfect teenage crush and the kind of screen presence people tend to freeze in memory. For many fans, he did not simply belong to the film. He became one of the reasons the film never really disappeared. What happened next, though, was never the kind of story Hollywood usually likes to tell. While his fame grew through films like Vision Quest and Mermaids, Schoeffling seemed to drift in the opposite direction of the spotlight that had made him famous. He married Valerie Carpenter Bernstein in 1987 and built a family life that stood in quiet contrast to the fantasy image audiences still projected onto him. On the surface, it may have looked like he had everything an actor was supposed to want. But the industry that celebrated his face did not necessarily offer him the kind of future that felt stable or meaningful. Over time, the attention, the pressure, and the feeling of being valued more for appearance than identity appear to have pushed him toward a very different choice. Then came the move that turned him into one of the most mysterious figures connected to the film. In 1991, after Wild Hearts Can't Be Broken, he stepped away from acting completely. Not for a scandal, not for a public breakdown, not because of some dramatic career implosion. He simply left. That silence created its own mythology. Rumors filled the gap because Hollywood rarely knows what to do with someone who walks away voluntarily. But the truth that emerged was quieter and, in some ways, more striking. Schoeffling chose a private life, opened a woodworking business, and began building furniture by hand, far from the machinery of celebrity. As of 2026, Michael Schoeffling is 65 years old, and still remembered less for what he said than for what he refused to become. His estimated net worth is around $1.5 million, and maybe that is why his story still holds such strange power. In a town built on visibility, he became unforgettable by disappearing. Not every actor from 16 Candles carried their fame the same way. Some leaned into the spotlight. Cusack seemed to spend much of his career resisting it. In the film, his role was small, almost easy to miss compared with the larger personalities around him. But that brief appearance sat near the beginning of a career that would eventually make him one of the most recognizable and least predictable actors of his generation. He had the face of a leading man, but never seemed fully interested in becoming the polished version Hollywood prefers. That tension may be one reason his story feels so different from the usual path people expect. Cusack built his name through films that gave him intelligence, distance, and a kind of guarded intensity that audiences could not easily read. While other stars turned their private lives into part of their public image, he did the opposite. He never married, kept his relationships largely out of view, and developed a reputation for protecting his personal world with unusual force. To some, that made him mysterious. To others, difficult. Industry circles often painted him as stubborn, selective, and unwilling to play the social game that keeps many careers moving smoothly behind the scenes. That image only hardened as he chose stranger, riskier, more offbeat projects instead of the safer route of becoming a conventional studio favorite. Over time, the complications around him moved beyond acting. His political views became part of his public identity, and his blunt style on social media repeatedly pulled him into backlash, criticism, and arguments that seemed to push him even farther from the Hollywood mainstream. Long before that, his private life had already been shaken in a more disturbing way. In 2008, a woman was arrested for stalking him outside his Malibu home, turning his guarded relationship with fame into something even darker and more personal. It was the kind of incident that made privacy feel less like a preference and more like self-defense. As of 2026, Cusack is 60 years old and still remains hard to pin down. His estimated net worth is around $50 million. But the reason his story lingers is not just his success. It is the feeling that even after decades in front of cameras, he never let Hollywood fully claim him. Sometimes the people who seem the most unforgettable on screen are the ones least protected from what fame can do behind it. In 16 Candles, Anthony Michael Hall made Ted feel far bigger than a side character. He was awkward, impulsive, funny, and impossible to ignore. That performance helped shape one of the most recognizable teenage archetypes of the 1980s, the boy who looked ridiculous on the surface, but carried something more vulnerable underneath. For many viewers, he became one of the clearest faces of that era. What few people could see at the time was how quickly that kind of recognition could turn into pressure. Hall became famous so early that the gap between who he was and how the public saw him began forming before he was ready for it. While his career kept moving, stories about tension off-screen started becoming part of his reputation too. During his time on Saturday Night Live, reports painted him as difficult, temperamental, and hard to manage. Whether that image was fully fair or not, it followed him at an age when most people are still figuring out who they are. The industry often rewards young stars for confidence, then punishes them the moment that confidence starts looking unstable. As the years went on, the cracks became harder to hide. Alcohol abuse, emotional volatility, depression, and bipolar disorder all became part of a much darker chapter in his life. The bright energy that once made him stand out in teen movies slowly gave way to something more troubled and unpredictable. Then in 2016, that private instability spilled into public view when he was arrested after a violent dispute with a neighbor left the other man injured. The case ended with probation, but the damage to his image had already been done. By then, the boy audiences remembered had long since been replaced by a man fighting battles they never saw coming. Nowadays, Anthony Michael Hall is 58 years old, living in Los Angeles with Lucia Oscarova and their son, who was born in 2023. His estimated net worth is around $10 million. What makes his story hit so hard is not only the scandal or the struggle, but the unsettling thought that for some young stars, fame does not arrive after they become themselves. It arrives first, and leaves them to catch up later. Some performers are remembered not because they were placed at the center, but because they made even the smallest moment impossible to forget. That was Joan Cusack in 16 Candles. Her part was brief, eccentric, almost exaggerated, yet it instantly revealed the offbeat comic energy that would later become her signature. She was never framed like the classic glamorous star, and maybe that was exactly why she stood out. There was something unpredictable about her presence, something that felt too strange to be polished and too alive to ignore. That same quality helped build her career, but it also shaped the limits placed around it. While other actresses were pushed toward leading lady status, Joan was often steered into the role of the oddball, the outsider, the woman whose job was to make a scene more memorable without ever becoming its romantic center. Over time, that pattern became one of the quiet frustrations of her career. She earned admiration, critical respect, and even Academy Award nominations, yet the industry kept returning to the same basic idea of who she was supposed to be. It was a strange kind of success, visible enough to be loved, but boxed in enough to feel underestimated. Even alongside the rise of her younger brother, John Cusack, comparisons followed her in ways that made it harder to be seen purely on her own terms. Still, Joan did something many actors never manage. She turned limitation into identity. Rather than fighting to become the version of stardom Hollywood more easily rewards, she leaned into the eccentricity that others may have once seen as a barrier. That is part of what made her work in films like Working Girl, In and Out, Addams Family Values, and later the Toy Story series feel so lasting. She was not simply filling space around bigger stars, she was creating a kind of presence no one else could quite imitate. Behind that success, though, was still the emotional reality of being valued for being unusual, while rarely being treated as central. Today, Joan Cusack is 64 years old and lives much of her life away from the usual Hollywood machinery, focusing on family, selective work, and her gift shop in Chicago. Her estimated net worth is around $22 million. What gives her story real weight is the feeling that she spent decades proving how unforgettable she was in an industry that kept acting as if unforgettable was somehow not enough. Not every future power player in Hollywood arrives with that kind of label attached to them. In 16 Candles, Jami Gertz appeared as Robin, one of those stylish figures who helped give the film its glossy teenage atmosphere. It was not the kind of role that screamed destiny. Still, there was already something camera-ready about her, a polish that suggested she belonged in that world. At the time, few people would have guessed that the young actress in a supporting part would go on to build one of the most financially extraordinary lives of anyone connected to the film. What makes her path so fascinating is how sharply it split from the usual rise and fall people expect from Hollywood stories. As her acting career continued through films like Less Than Zero and later television work, Gertz seemed to be building a familiar kind of success. Then her marriage to businessman Tony Ressler shifted the way the public viewed her. From the outside, it looked like a glamorous union between entertainment and enormous wealth. From the inside, it also invited years of suspicion, gossip, and quiet resentment. Some critics reduced her to the actress who married into money, as if her life could suddenly be explained by one decision. That kind of judgment can be especially sharp in Hollywood, where women are often treated as strategic before they are treated as human. As the family's financial empire expanded and their names became tied to major sports ownership, the whispers changed shape but never fully disappeared. Instead of wondering whether she would stay relevant in entertainment, people began questioning how much influence, privilege, and access had reshaped her world. Yet that version of the story never tells the whole truth. Gertz did not vanish into luxury and disappear from view. She remained active, visible, and increasingly connected to philanthropy, public service, and the business world surrounding major franchises like the Atlanta Hawks. In other words, she moved beyond the narrow identity people first gave her. What looked to some like a fairy tale marriage became something more complicated, a life lived under a different kind of scrutiny, where success itself became a reason for suspicion. Now in her early 60s, Jami Gertz continues balancing public presence, family life, and large-scale charitable work. Her estimated net worth is around $3.2 billion. The striking part of her story is not simply that she became rich. It is that she outgrew the frame Hollywood first placed around her and ended up becoming far more powerful than anyone watching 16 Candles could have imagined. There are actors who dominate a film with noise, and then there are actors who hold it together almost quietly. In 16 Candles, Paul Dooley gave Jim Bakker a warmth that felt steady in the middle of all the teenage chaos. He was the tired but loving father, the kind of presence that grounded the movie without ever asking for attention. To most viewers, he came across as gentle, dependable, and almost comforting, like the kind of man life would naturally soften with age. What sat behind that image was more fragile than it first appeared. Long before late-life respect settled over his career, Dooley's personal life had already gone through its own painful reshaping. His first marriage, to Donna Lee Wassler, brought children and the structure of family, but it did not survive the strain that slowly built over the years. Success came gradually for him rather than all at once, and that kind of slow climb can carry its own private damage. The breakdown of that marriage reportedly left emotional distance between him and his children during years that mattered most. That loss did not explode into scandal, which may be part of why it feels sadder. It was not dramatic enough to become public spectacle, only personal enough to leave its mark. When he later met writer Winnie Holzman and built a second marriage, the stability that followed seemed less like luck and more like something earned after a long period of quiet fracture. Age brought another shift, this time in his body rather than his relationships. Hearing loss began making conversations harder. Joint pain made movement less easy than it once had been. The kind of changes many older actors endure in silence started becoming part of his daily reality. Even so, he did not simply disappear into nostalgia. Instead, he turned inward and reflected on the strange balance between career and family, eventually publishing his memoir, a sign that he was still trying to understand the life he had lived both on screen and away from it. Now 98 years old, Paul Dooley remains one of those rare performers whose story feels more moving the older it gets. He still shares his life with Winnie Holzman in Los Angeles, and his estimated net worth is around $7 million. What stays with you is not scandal or spectacle, but the quieter ache of a man who spent years bringing warmth to the screen while carrying losses no audience could fully measure. By the time Carol Cook appeared in 16 Candles, she did not need much screen time to leave an impression. As Grandma Helen, she brought a mischievous sharpness to the Bakker family, the kind of energy that can make a supporting character feel strangely unforgettable. There was humor in the performance, but also precision. She came across like someone who understood exactly how to steal a moment without forcing it. To many viewers, she was simply one more eccentric presence in a film filled with comic chaos. But off-screen, the final years of her life took a far more unsettling turn than that brief role ever suggested. For decades, Cook's personal life seemed unusually stable by Hollywood standards. Her marriage to actor and writer Tom Troop lasted for nearly 60 years, a rare kind of endurance in an industry better known for collapse than constancy. Even their wedding carried old Hollywood glamour, with Lucille Ball serving as matron of honor. That long partnership helped shape the image of Cook as one of those performers who moved through show business without becoming consumed by it. She built a career across stage, television, and film, and the steadiness of that life became part of what made her seem so different from many others around her. Then, late in life, that calm image cracked in public. At 94, Cook drew outrage after making a shocking political remark about a sitting United States president during an interview. What some dismissed as reckless dark humor, others treated as something much more serious. The backlash escalated quickly, and reports said even the Secret Service became involved. It was the kind of controversy that felt especially jarring because it arrived so late, almost as if the final chapter of her life had suddenly been rewritten by one moment people could not stop discussing. Instead of quiet closure, she found herself pulled into one last storm of public reaction and divided opinion. Just days before what would have been her 99th birthday, Carol Cook died of heart failure in Beverly Hills in 2023. She left behind Tom Troop, a long career, and an estimated net worth of around $5 million. What gives her story its strange aftertaste is the contrast itself. For so many years, she seemed to represent endurance, wit, and balance. Yet in the end, even her legacy was touched by controversy, a reminder that Hollywood rarely lets anyone leave the stage without one final complication. What makes the cast of 16 Candles so haunting to look back on is not just how much they changed, but how differently life unfolded once the cameras stopped. Some held on to parts of the fame that first made them unforgettable. Others stepped away from it, struggled beneath it, or found themselves carrying disappointments no audience could have predicted from a single film. That may be why stories like these continue to stay with people. A movie can freeze someone in time, but real life never does. It keeps moving, with all the loneliness, reinvention, regret, and resilience that come with it. So after looking back at these familiar faces, which story stayed with you the most, and which one surprised you the most once the spotlight faded? If you enjoy revisiting the hidden human stories behind classic Hollywood names, subscribe and stay with us for the next one.